is Denise Lim, and it's been such a great pleasure to work with the Philadelphia Photo Arts Center to plan and organize this webinar series, Finding Focus in Times of Crisis. I see we have audience members who are still joining us, but today is our third and final session of our series, What Images Teach Us. Just to share a little bit about myself, I'm a recent PhD graduate in sociology from Yale, and I'm currently lecturing at Yale this semester for a course entitled Space, Time, and the African City. I think I have some of my students who are here joining in on the class. I hope it'll be of interest. I also work as a Strategic Initiatives Fellow at the Yale Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. So I'm currently helping to co-design a survey where we measure the impact that COVID-19 has had on cultural conservation and heritage throughout the African continent. As someone that's really passionate about the relationship between the creative arts and social justice, I was personally motivated to organize this event as a means of educating others on different ways that we can reimagine the creative arts and its ability to address personal or even collective trauma. As Lori mentioned, we are recording our session today, so you can access the recording afterwards on the PPAC website where you all registered for the event or on their YouTube channel. There will be closed captioning available for those of you who might need it. So there will be the provision of English language subtitles so you can follow our discussion. And please do feel free to rewatch or to forward the recording to others who may have missed our session today or just really interested in the topics that we'll be discussing. To create as inclusive and accessible a virtual space as possible, I have asked all of our speakers today to be mindful to identify themselves when they first speak so you can recognize their voice, and also to describe their own physical appearance and their setting. Especially for those of you who might be visually impaired or you're tuning in using audio or you can't see your screen and see us or any of the images that we might be sharing with you over Zoom. I mentioned this at the start, but we chose to hold this event as a webinar, so you'll notice that you can only see the panelists on your screen and you can't see one another as attendees or unmute yourself, but we do want to encourage you to use the chat box function. So you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's one button that says chat and the other one says Q&A. We do encourage you that as we have our discussions today, if you have questions for our panelists, use the Q&A button. But if you want to socialize with the other attendees or ask questions of the PPAC staff, you can use that chat box function. So feel free to tell us where you're from, what profession you might be, or what interested you to join our event today. Then of course, we'll reserve about 30 minutes at the end of our session from 1 to 1:30 p.m. to try to get us through as many of the questions that you all submit as possible. So I'll try to allow enough time for our panelists to respond. Now, before we dive into the heart of our discussion, I want to be mindful that today is September 11th. Though we didn't necessarily mean to choose this day on purpose to hold our session, we thought, given that our webinar series is about finding focus in times of crisis, perhaps the content of what we share today is actually appropriate for what this date has come to signify. Of course, on this day in 2001, now 19 years ago, many woke up to the shocking news footage of two planes crashing into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, with a third plane hitting the Pentagon just outside Washington, D.C. Many were devastated by the lives lost that day, and the crisis it catalyzed still has a complicated significance. There was the rise in Islamophobic attack and anti-Muslim sentiment, a loaded language around who was labeled or imagined as patriots or terrorists, and national security and surveillance was forever changed worldwide as a result. So we now carry the significance of that event, and its pertinence in our moment today is all the more relevant as we face intersecting social crises, including, but of course not exclusive to, the current COVID-19 pandemic, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and of course, devastating economic upheaval and recession. It seems fitting then that as we recall these histories of crisis and trauma in our recent past and in our present, to give space right now to pause, reflect, and provide a land acknowledgement. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar, a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects the indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the land that we currently occupy and continue to be in the present and future. As our series is brought to you by the Philadelphia Photo Arts Center, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which PPAC is situated. We openly recognize the Lenape Indian tribe as the original inhabitants of Eastern Pennsylvania. We acknowledge the Lenape people as the indigenous stewards of their homeland and spiritual keepers of the Lenape Sipu, what some now know to be the Delaware River. Hereby to actively supporting our Lenape sisters and brothers in whatever way we are able, and by helping to preserve and maintain both the cultural identity and heritage of Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, and Southern New York. I ask that we all take a moment to consider the intertwined legacies of settler colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and state-sanctioned violence that both indigenous communities and people of color in the United States have been forced to endure. I ask that we continue to reflect upon a few key questions. Who gets to belong to the communities in which we reside? What people and communities are seen as valuable or legible? Who is seen as disposable or negligible? As we think about how to fight for and support our Indigenous, Brown, and Black communities, I invite you today to join us in acknowledging that we have a shared responsibility to make good for the time and space we create here today, and for each of us to consider the role we play in our efforts toward collective decolonization, reconciliation, and solidarity. Again, my name is Denise, and I identify as a Chinese American woman with cultural heritage ties to Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Canada, all of which are colonized spaces. I have warm tone beige skin with olive undertones, shoulder length black hair, and I'm speaking to you today from my little corner of my living room in downtown New Haven, Connecticut. Behind me is a gallery wall of different works of art that I've collected over my lifetime, and they all hold really special significance to me. My personal space really calms and grounds me, so I hope that all of you tuning in today are able to also have or create grounding space for yourself. I'm really excited to have joining us today 3 speakers whom I feel will offer really interesting ideas and insight regarding what visual sociology is and why that matters. Today we've got Dr. David Herman Jr., who is an assistant professor of art education at the Tyler School of Art and Architecture at Temple University. He is a lens-based artist, educator, and scholar whose work explores the relations between the perceptual and the social as a politics of ontology. He's the co-founder of Preservation Link, an arts education nonprofit dedicated to creating visual literacy curricula for communities who have been historically underrepresented. He also currently serves as an executive board member of the International Visual Sociology Association, advisory committee member for Brandywine Workshop and Archives Digital Project Portal Project, and he's also the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Commission member for the National Arts Education Association. We also have Maria Carolina Cambre, who is an associate professor in education at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. Under the broad rubrics of visual sociology and post-critical pedagogies, her work explores vernacular visual expression and a range of research interests, including critical policy analysis, sociology of information, image studies, and the politics of representation. Much of Cambre's work is engaged with several of the following questions. How do people produce and direct the visual space? How is the image a type of doing? And what are the social and cultural workings of images? Cambre currently has ongoing projects that research visual processes of legitimation, representation of online sharing, selfies and the politics of identity, and polymedia literacies. She is the author of The Semiotics of Che Guevara, Affective Gateways, and her artistic work in the medium of encaustic photography and multimedia collage has been featured as cover art for a number of magazines, books, and juried competitions. And then finally, we have Jerome Krase, who is an emeritus and Murray Kopelman professor at Brooklyn College CUNY, an activist scholar, and received his PhD at New York University. He researches, lectures, writes, and photographs about urban life and culture globally. Relevant books include Seeing Cities Change, Local Culture and Class, Race, Class, and Gentrification in Brooklyn, and Diversity in Local Contexts. He also co-edits Urbanities and serves on the editorial board of the Visual Studies Journal. He is active in many social science associations, including HNET, Humanities Online, International Visual Sociology Association, and American Association for the Advancement of Science. So thank you to David, Cece, Jerry for joining us today. If you wouldn't mind, I'll hand it over to you all to please identify yourself when you first speak and go ahead and describe yourself for those of us in the audience who might be listening but can't see you.
I'll go. So thank you, Denise, Jerry, and Cece. My name is David Herman Jr. I am here in Philadelphia, just about 5 blocks on the north side of Philadelphia from the main campus of Temple University in my studio. And I'm originally from South Carolina, so the acknowledgement that I'd like to give in addition to your acknowledgement, Denise, is the acknowledgement of the Africans that were enslaved and particularly brought to South Carolina and Georgia, South Carolina, where I call home. I am a dark Black man that has Gullah Geechee roots, and I have a dark blue shirt on with about 5 colored Mobius strips and a small bookshelf in the background with some other materials hanging on the wall as ornaments, decoration, and I think that's it. I have glasses on.
Thank you.
Okay.
Stacey, do you want to go? Oh, Jerry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay, yeah. I wasn't thinking of saying this, but people have mentioned their background. So I'm of Sicilian and Rusine, that might require a lot of explanation, grandfather, who was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm sitting in my study, which has lots of books and memorabilia behind me. Now, what do I look like requires a translation of senses. And since this session will only show my face, really, I would employ the sense of touch and hope that my audience has shopped for fruits and vegetables. My head is about as large as a mid-sized melon, wider at the top, and at my advanced age, the feel of my skin with creases, wrinkles, and stubby beard is more like a rough cantaloupe than a smooth watermelon. My eyes are like large half-open walnuts that are set deeply into my face, and they're topped rather sparsely with untrimmed hairs and short lashes. Right now, my hair would feel like a mop of long corn silk. My small jalapeno-shaped nose is not very broad and protrudes only about 1 inch from my face, sitting a bit above my somewhat pouty lips and squarish, slightly protruding chin that rests on a rather thick neck whose Adam apple is camouflaged with some excessive hanging skin like a turkey neck. Finally, my ears are like the tops of large oyster mushrooms. Now, although this might seem grotesque to you, the combination seems pleasant to most observers, and for some, even appetizing. Carolina?
Thanks, Jerry. My name is Carolina. My friends call me Cece. I work in Concordia University in Montreal, which is located on Kanien'kehá:ka territory. And I am wearing glasses right now, but I usually use them only to read. They're always dirty, no matter how much I clean them. I'm Argentine, living in Canada, and have dual nationalities, and so I'm both an immigrant and a settler here, tall with dark hair and good voice projection. If we're gonna draw on the senses intersensorially, Sound perception, like the visual, is something culturally and socially inflected. So while to Canadians, I may often sound like a little bit loud when I think I'm speaking normally. In other places, such as Malta, I might actually be a low talker. As a native Spanish speaker who passes as a native English speaker, I often wrestle with my own contradictory positions. And I think probably a lot of people in the immigrant community can relate to that. While US Americans recall and mark September 9/11 as a day that shook their nation and rocked the news around the world, many in Latin America recall the original 9/11 in 1973, which, given the ongoing externally sponsored crisis in Latin America, is also a day of crisis and a day to remember, because on this day, the democratically elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende, died during a coup d'etat led by Augusto Pinochet, commander-in-chief of the army. His final radio address was made while gunfire and explosions were clearly audible in the background in the presidential palace. The Nixon administration created the conditions for this coup and was quick to recognize military rule. In the aftermath, over 3,000 people were murdered, tens of thousands were tortured, and hundreds of thousands driven from the country. Because I live in Canada, I also recognize Canada's support, especially with banking and direct investments from Canadian companies into the Pinochet dictatorship, valued at nearly $1 billion, that signifies that we continue to occupy and elaborate and enact a position of domination and aggression against Latin America.
Thank you, Cece. I really appreciate your offering an acknowledgement of what this day would mean to you and also where you are situated. And I am really excited actually today to talk to you all, because I know there's many in the audience who may not know what visual sociology is. I do see that in the chat box, one of our participants said that they're a socio-anthropologist, but I thought we could start our conversation first with asking each of you, what does visual sociology mean and why does it matter?
Should we keep going in the same order?
That makes sense.
It's up to you all. Yeah, sure. David, if you want to start us off.
I'll go first. So I'd like to just situate it in terms of me with a camera at about 7 years old. So it was early in my life that I became familiar with a relationship with that kind of device. And I can recall in retrospect that in some ways that device cloaked or covered me and allowed me to be more at ease in spaces. I feel like I've since come out of that. And I don't want to say come out of it because it makes it seem like it's a negative thing, but I've realized that relationship with the camera. And in doing so, when I think about visual sociology, I think about positionality and about how I'm viewing the world, but not only how I'm viewing the world, how I am being along with the world. So for me, visual sociology is always moves towards a perceptual way of thinking or considering. And then you have to think about if it's not just the visual and it's the body, and like Jerry and Cece mentioned in their introductions about the sensorium, what does that mean in terms of being with other bodies? And not just human bodies. What does that mean for a human body being in a room with things, in a room with sound, in a space with sound? And how do we extend out and reach and intermingle and really what is generated from that. So for me in my work, when I think about visual sociology, I am really thinking about relationships and what emerges from those varied relationships.
And David, could you just for the audience define what positionality means? That might be a term that not everyone is familiar with.
Yeah, so when you asked us to describe ourselves, who we are, and we put ourselves in context to like place, but we also put ourselves in context to history and culture. So positionality is a matter of how do you identify who you are, where you are, almost like your stance, you know, your point of view, how you are being made aware of the world from that internal perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Jerry.
I guess it's the fruit and vegetable guy's turn. Okay, so you gave us like, I think 5 questions. I'm going to try to see whether I can put them all together. And I have to say that these are questions that I have often addressed in my work because, you know, for more than a half a century, I've been an activist scholar. And I want everybody to note that the activist precedes the scholar. You know, I saw injustice essentially all around me. I tried to record it at first, not with a camera, but with ethnography and writing about it. And then using my words and later my images to help rectify the problem for those in the picture, so to speak. So the most succinct statement I can make is a quote from my book, Seeing Cities Change, which I hope everybody will read. I'll send anybody the introduction, which is, says it all. So visual sociology is best defined by what we do as opposed to a formula or some kind of requirement for membership in an exclusive professional group. I study cities and neighborhoods. So the way I look at it is when I first passed through urban spaces, such as a neighborhood I hadn't visited before, I'm like a tourist, and I'm using my eyes to decipher the cues and the clues that loudly and quietly surround us. And Carolina might mention in her work, some of these things are not visible. We have to make them visible. And we might ask ourselves then, is this a safe or a dangerous place? Am I welcome here or should I leave before it is too late? What kind of neighborhood is this? Are the people who live here rich or poor? What is their race, ethnicity, or religion? And how or why does it matter? Some things are easy to tell on a street, such as whether there are things for sale. Legitimate merchants make it obvious that they are seeking customers with signs that compete for attention. But the sale of illicit goods, the signs vendors give off there are much more subtle. Yet it seems that for the knowledgeable, they are in plain view. The reading of these street signs is not merely an aesthetic exercise. What we see makes a difference in how we respond to the places and the people we encounter in our increasingly complex and changing urban surroundings. So I should note my own visual work, you know, is still photography. I don't consider myself a photographer, but I also use many other media, not necessarily what my own produced stuff, but other stuff. I only focus in my work what is in public view and investigate through other means what may lay behind the curtain. Okay, I do that, I teach my students that all the time. Homelessness, for example, is often in public view. And now with cell phones, so is police brutality. It's an interesting thing in terms of how technology has changed, not only what it is that we see, but how we respond to it. And I'll talk about some of that stuff today. So visual sociology, at least how I practice it, is aimed at helping to attain distributive social justice, which talks about what do people deserve, you know, simply by being, right? And this in turn requires, I believe, political activism. If you see something wrong, I believe you have to try to do something about it. Okay, so Carolina?
Thanks, Jerry. I echo what my colleagues have explained. I think that for students, when they're wondering what visual sociology is, it's the same as sociology. It's a para field, but it attends to visual aspects and doesn't relegate them to some kind of margin or subsume them in importance in terms of empirical value to text. If you pull off an issue of the American Journal of Sociology from 100 years ago, the turn of the century, 1899, 1900, you'll find something that you don't see today in these journals, and that is it's full of images. And that's because there was a shift in the field of sociology writ large against imagery and forms of knowing onto epistemological kinds of understandings of the world that were not text or number based. So this is an important sort of historical trajectory, and it's part of the reason that visual sociology is something that people don't really want to define, because it's a field full of all the subfields that sociology has. So there's urban sociology, sociology of labor, all these areas also have their visual sociology correspondence. So that's kind of how I look at it, as a parafield that has sort of post-disciplinary features, because anytime you have the word visual, you're sort of really putting a little bit of anarchy into the idea of disciplines, and it just explodes all borders. So you can think of it that way. Why does it matter? Because visual sociology attends to the act of looking, and like David was saying, the positionality. I am creating something by the looking. It's also informing and forming me. There's a dynamic of witnessing and testimonial that is part of this process. And what visual sociology does is it refuses to ignore who the looker is and what their looking is doing to what they see. So that is a position of critical reflexivity on the part of a researcher.
Thank you, Cece. I appreciate that you're highlighting that it's really important to notice who the looker is and what it does to look and also to produce these images. I had asked all of you to contribute about 2 images each. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen so we can take a look at those images together and just have you each talk about it a little bit. Here we go. All right, are you all able to see clearly?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So Jerry, I believe this is your image, but maybe just describe for the audience, in case they can't see the image, what we're looking at.
Yeah, well, first I should explain, I was doing a research project about what it's like in a super gentrified neighborhood, which is a neighborhood in which I live. What was going on during COVID, you know, in terms of how people were responding to it. For me, it was important because there's the assumption, you know, when we use labels, even like gentrifier, et cetera, that there's the assumption that's all gentrifiers do is gentrify, whatever, you know, in other words, that all they're thinking about is, you know, going to boutiques and cafes and stuff like that. But gentrifiers, just like poor people in society, are human beings, and they're trying to deal with life. And I just happened to be, again, serendipitously, in a spot in Brooklyn, New York, which is an assembly point frequently for all kinds of marches and demonstrations. This is, so this COVID-19 crisis coincides with the Black Lives Matter movement and the assembly of people at this spot, which is just up the block from where I live, for demonstrations and marches. And there was, in about a 2-week period of time, there are probably 4 or 5 different marches for different reasons, right? And this particular one, as you can, as you might be able to tell, to see it, I'll describe it a little bit, is a large number of people who are assembling. This is a family march to defund the police, for Black Lives Matter. There are people with children on bicycles and roller skates and skateboards, and people pushing children in carriages, etc. And it's the ethnic composition of the population, the visual aspect of it, shows basically what the neighborhood is like. It's predominantly white, or as I say, they are people of little or no color. And you know, they're middle and upper middle class people, and they showed up for this particular march, and they're holding up signs such as, you know, defund the police, etc. And so I thought, in terms of the, you know, what we wanted for this presentation about trauma, was to show how people were responding to both of these things. Of course, at the same time that they're here demonstrating, they're also masked up. They all have their masks on, which is typical in this kind of a neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. We see the compliance with that. So you want to just talk about that one, or the next one? Now, I should also tell you, in terms of technique, what I tend to do when I photograph is not to photograph randomly, but to try to capture as much as I possibly can what actually is going on, and then only later, or sometimes while I'm there, to focus on particular things that draw my attention, right? So right now, this is one of probably about 100 photographs, just of pans of the crowd. And I was in other demonstrations too, so different stuff. So I don't know whether you want to show the next photograph, which was part of that same demonstration.
Sure.
Okay, so here you could see, those of you who have good visual acuity, we'll be able to tell that this is a photograph where I'm taking something into a crowd and actually not focusing on anything, right? So there's stuff that's way out of focus, those of you who are photographers, etc. And I wanted to include this particular photograph because on the right-hand side, there's somebody on the shoulders of a person wearing a mask, all right? And I'm trying to remember what that mask is. Somebody could come up with the word right away. We'd all recognize it because it's a common protest mask in global stuff. I can tell, or I think I can tell, from the texture of the hair and the color of the skin of the person that's standing there with a child on their shoulders, that they're African American or Afro Caribbean. And the kid is who has a mask on but it's pulled down, is carrying a sign, which you can't read the whole thing, but you know, we would be able to translate that sign even without seeing all the words. And what it's saying is you know, and it has to make you want to move, want to do something. Is my daddy next, right? So. And so I wanted to choose this particular photograph because it's the kind of a photograph that I think, you know, would make most reasonably sensitive viewers, you know, question what's going on, and be moved to try to answer that question, and to try to do something about it, because I can't see too many people looking at this and saying, yes, I hope your daddy is next. Although I know that in the society in which we live, there are unfortunately millions of people who actually will be thinking that. And that has to be discussed. That has to be, I think, right out in the open, because it often is not. Anyhow, so that's the 2 photographs that I have.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. And actually, both Cece and then another participant in the audience, Sarah, pointed out that the mask is called Guy Fawkes, and it was also featured in the film V for Vendetta.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm also really...
Yeah, it's constantly used in demonstrations, or actually globally, and so that's another connection here. This is not something which is just taking place a few steps away from where I live. This is something that's happening in the world. Okay, I'm sorry, I'll mute myself. So.
No, thank you, Jerry. I'm also struck by, in both your photographs, my eye is really drawn to those signs and thinking about what the text is saying in relation to the people in the image. And I was really struck that you focused on thinking something that was quote unquote out of focus, right? Like it was on the kind of the side of the composition. And yet there is so much we could draw from thinking about what the sign says, what it means to have a young child holding that sign on the shoulders of an adult. Given that the sign asks, like, is my daddy next? Is that the child's father that the child is like sort of sitting on? So I appreciate you giving us some context. I'm wondering if our other panelists, David and Cece, if looking at these images that Jerry contributed also provoked other thoughts and questions.
Well, I guess I'm surprised by the absence of police.
Okay, yeah, there are police all over the place here. The problem is that they're not in the crowd. There are, I mean, from my knowledge of it, there are a number also of plainclothes persons in the crowd, and this crowd is actually surrounded by uniformed police and squad cars. This one, they didn't expect much violence, so you don't see them too much. But in some other ones, if I were to show you where there was a youth protest, where the kids were banging and all kinds of stuff, actually they were led and followed by several patrol cars. Yeah, so it's certainly the privilege of this particular crowd. All right, made it unlikely that one would see any altercations between, at least between uniformed police, etc. But I've been in several other places over the years and recently where that's not the case. Where there's a great deal of tension. Anyway, yeah, good. All right.
I guess the thing that comes to mind for me is not just these images, but in the present moment, thinking how anxious it is, to me anyway, to think about the descriptions of images. I mean, I don't know, it's something about the assumptive factor in even describing images, especially with people.
Yes. Yeah, I wonder if, I don't know if David, you feel like we should move to your images, but I was thinking about that question where when we look at an image and we don't necessarily know the context in which it was taken, how much assumption can we make, whether that's about how race or gender or what's happening in the scene. And I wonder if you thought about that too as you were selecting images to share with us.
Yeah, that's in my introduction, that's what I talked about, is that the point is we do this. That whether we're right or wrong is less important than understanding that that's in fact what we do, is we make judgments based upon what it is that we see. And as I've talked about in other places, is our interpretations of what it is that we see don't emanate from the image or the presentation, the representation, the representation doesn't emanate from that. It comes from our prior socialization. I mean, this is where the sociological and social psychological context is important. I'm seeing these things and saying these things and feeling these things because of how I've been raised, because of how I've learned, you know. And by the way, I'm not the same as I was 70 some odd years ago. You know, so I'm looking at these things and placing it in that kind of a context. And as I've changed my own position, you know, in terms of, you know, becoming a grown-up, you know, whatever, father or grandfather, etc., my feelings about what it is that I see, particularly for this for this kid on, I think it's his mother's, his or her mother's shoulder, because I see a bun of hair if I look a little more closely. I'm looking at it from the point of view of thinking in terms of having my own children and grandchildren, and how I would feel if they were in that kind of a situation. You know, I know my grandchildren and my children have feared, for example, for my safety when I was involved in activities, social activities, etc. I've been in the middle of what people call riot situations, or other people call insurrections. You know, so I've gone through it, etc. So that interpretation is important. You know. And I would assume not only the panelists, but also the people who are watching this could have very, very different interpretation, very, very different meanings that they have. And their interpretation, stuff like that, I'm not talking about right or wrong. You know, what I'm talking about is this is what I see. And what I'm hoping some other people would see, but knowing that they might not see. You know, in fact, I know, you know, people just looking at me and hearing me described as a vegetable, etc., also might have a response to it. You know, I've seen that before. I think very quickly I can tell you that in terms of my activism, the first stuff that I did was I was living in a neighborhood that was 95% or more African American, Afro-Caribbean. And so, you know, without people seeing me, you know, the way I was treated on paper, I learned in terms of not being able to get mortgages and loans and stuff like that. So there are different kinds of experiences that you get. So I think
right.
it's time for other.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Jerry. I think it's important to acknowledge how partly what I think sociologists tried to do is bring some self-awareness to your own position and how you're perceived and why you perceive or see things the way that you do. So I'd love to move us to David's sets of images, and also to invite the audience that as you're looking at these images with us, feel free to provide what your descriptions of what you think you see. Or sort of your imaginary caption, but we'd also love to get sort of your feedback as we're discussing. And just to remind you all that you're very free to submit questions in the Q&A box too, if you have questions for the panelists. But David, yeah, if I could just turn it to you to provide us some context for this image.
Yeah, no, thank you. I want to reiterate, actually I want to take this conversation up this way and reiterate what you just said, Denise, encouraging the participants to just look at the image and type the first thing you notice. I chose two images without any humans. They're both landscape. The one that we're looking at now is a wide angle landscape of an open field with a river of sorts, which actually is called a dike, running along in a very 2/3 orientation, just on the right side. And I tend to think about, I was talking to an artist at one point, Othello Beck, at the Dallas Fair. He went there every year, and his paintings are magnificent. And I just remember him, this was a long time ago, asking him, like, how does he paint? Like, where does he begin? And he said, just start with the thing that you see furthest away. So I have, you know, when I look at images, I tend to, even if I don't go there first, I make sure that I don't leave it out. So in the back of this image, I mean, we're looking out into this field and seeing the sky, blue but clouded. And then we see this line, this horizon line of forest, the trees, and then we come into this open field of green and brown hues, almost looking a little bit like, I don't know, a mix of corn or some kind of vegetation like that. And then one thing that I want to say, particularly about looking images and understanding, is not only is it important to think about positionality, but it's like history has to come into play. So even though we're looking at this image, like you mentioned earlier, Denise, where like you don't really know what you're looking at, you have to know that you're looking at history. You're looking at an object that has stories to tell, which is one of the reasons why I get a little bit anxious. That's probably not the right word, but about even describing images, or I should say when it's time to critique people's work. Trying to think about the approach of not necessarily making assumptions. This is actually in South Carolina. Like I said, I've had a camera, I've always documented home. And I was out with a cultural friend of mine, and they were taking me along. And if you've ever been to South Carolina on the East Coast, you can say that you've been on a plantation, because literally all of South Carolina on the East Coast, from one step to the next step, it is or was part of plantation life or chattel slavery. But this is the remnants of a rice field. So that river or that dike is, you know, part of the functionality of a rice field that's there in Georgetown County, where I call home. I'd like to go to the other landscape image, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Did you want me to read out loud what some of the attendees
Sure.
said that they saw?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So some said perspective, they see clouds, the path, the grass. One person said village, a field, an open journey, a pathway, undomesticated green space, even the word rural, lush grassy field. One person also said it didn't look like a patch, but a path, but a ditch.
Yeah. So again, context. That image.
Sorry.
And its context and its history is all of those things and more. I'll leave it there, right? I mean, when I look at this image, I feel a lot of pride in the fact that, you know, the African diaspora has and been what it is and continues to strive through. And this field is a sliver of that representation of moving forward. I also see home. You know, I mean, there are some pine trees in the background, and you know, that is very significant for me. Even when I'm coming down in a plane, like that's the first thing that I notice. So, you know, history and positionality And I think there was a time when we were all talking, just in kind of thinking about this day, Carolina, you mentioned the word implication, and that people are implicated. I think that we, in our looking practices, photography, art, just being in the world in the everyday, if you go to a park, whenever your body becomes awakened to the world, that understanding that history and context is a part of your day, really. So if you want to be attentive and critically attentive, kind of like Jerry, the way you were describing as an activist, critically attentive, then it takes that kind of attunement. But anyway, we can move to the other image. And I selected this image because it's not an image that I took, but it's an image that a student took of mine. You mentioned Preservation Link earlier. This is a nonprofit, arts education nonprofit that was established and based in Dallas, Texas. And the co-founder, Sean Wilson, and I had the honor of working with very young students, 3rd, 4th grade, all the way up to high school. But this image is of a 4th grader, Alex. This is one of a body of his work that's probably about 11 images that are just really powerful. And when I was looking at this image just last night and thinking about describing it, I was thinking about the photographer, and I was thinking about the way when he got his camera in his hand, it was almost like he had this thing, this comrade that he could use to like tell a story. Like, it was very clear in his body language and how he like went off with it. And, so this image, he's kneeling down, he's really close to this thing. And you see in the background, this house looks like a house, a small house low to the ground, probably a shotgun house. And as you come nearer to the photographer, you walk across the yard of green grass, and between the main subject and what I just described, there's a silver chain linked fence. And so just on the other side of that fence, the main idea of this image is a gold, I suppose it's a stiletto, high heel shoe, with kind of a palish gold, faded gold color, with this faux snake skin texture that's laying on the side, on the right side, so you can see the heel sitting on top of this like brown fall foliage with this. When I was looking at it, I was thinking, oh, it's kind of a spider web right at the top of the heel. But then it could be, I've seen as a Southern boy, where like caterpillars or something eventually weave some type of little cocoon or whatever the case might be.
Yeah,
and it's resting.
Yeah, I just saw that someone in the audience said it for them embodies longing. Cece offered it reminds her of a detective story, Cinderella. I wanted to kind of bring us back to, and another participant said that it seems like it's discarded, which I think is an interesting reading. Someone else said banal. I wanted to return to this question around being attentive about our assumptions, because we come kind of pre-socialized already. So when we encounter an image, we may not have context provided to us, right? So you were saying how it's important to think about the history, about positionality. But I wonder if, what are ways, I guess, that you all have developed in terms of being careful about those assumptions and being sensitive or attentive to histories or the kind of fraught meanings that could be sort of unearthed by our looking practices. And maybe we could think about that as we move to Cece's images, if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer that question, Denise, as a conclusion to this image. Like I said, this image is part of a visual literacy program with young folks. And there are three things that are asked of students when we're thinking about critique or looking at images. And the first is just to identify the facts, just to see it and tell me what you see, almost in the way that I talked about this image. And then the next thing I ask students is to look at the image and think about what relationships you see in the image. And then the last thing, which kind of speaks to history and positionality, is to what can you infer about this image? Because I feel like at that point, step by step, it maybe cuts back on the assumptive aspects of talking about images and allow someone to at least give some attention to the facts and the relationships in the image, and then what they might gain from the image. Because from that point, you can start to talk about, well, why do you see that? And how do you see that?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Denise. Like David, I'd love to invite people to put up captions for the photos or a title. And I'd love to riff off those because it's a very rich exercise. I think what David just described as sort of a stage by stage delving into a photo is part of a visually sociological approach, that it's not just about an atomistic breaking down of the elements, but you do need to go further. For me, when I think of an image, it's something that to which I cannot designate and address. I can't nail it down. It's always in motion. So it's more useful for people to think of images as imaging all the time. With Jerry's point about histories as well, is that meanings accrue to them. So visual sociology would never ask, what does this image mean? Because it doesn't mean anything. It's something that whose meaning lies in the use, as Wittgenstein would say, or who is part of a process and a collection. So it's something that is always working like an interface, right? It's connecting to things, it's separating from things, and so on. What we have here, I see some people have identified the US-Canada border. The US-Canada border in this time of crisis, a pandemic, and this particular one is the Rainbow Bridge to the USA. And this is one of two photos that I've shared, and I call them the unicorns because this is virtually, you would never see the US-Canada border empty like this, ever. The minimum lineup to cross that border in a vehicle is usually 45 minutes. And in rush hour or when trucks are crossing, you can be there for hours to cross into Niagara Falls, New York from Niagara Falls, Canada. So this is a strange, eerie atmosphere for someone who has seen this border often jam-packed. It's haunting because it's virtually unprecedented in the history of these two countries who share a friendly border. So you see how I can't talk about this image without talking about what's not there and other things connected to it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you used the word haunting. And I want to ask you a little more about that because part of the series is sort of trying to address crisis. It's interesting for me that you chose this image to contribute as sort of embodying that. So I wanted to press you a little bit further to share with us what you mean by the haunting, or what's so kind of disturbing about the absence, or what's present.
Well, I think a lot of it's related to anxiety, ambiguity. In Canada, there are regular polls on whether Canadians want the US border to open, and people are fairly strongly against that. So there's a lot of anxiety in this seemingly peaceful space. It's actually not a peaceful thing to see. The lack of friendly interchange. People walk across this bridge. People go for lunch in Buffalo or shopping. It's not happening, right? So we're haunted by those former times that we feel now will not be, our future has changed. This indicates that the future will now be different.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the attendees who offered a few captions. Many guessed border. One person said, this looks like it's constructed for humans, but not welcoming humans. One person isolated blue and gray, noticing those colors. One person said this could be anywhere. They noticed the duty-free sign, so duty-free, Rainbow Bridge to USA, Canada-US border, probably Fort Erie or Buffalo, Niagara Falls, a duty-free mall. So I think this leads us nicely, actually, CC, to your next image, and kind of thinking through some of these related ideas. Sorry, go ahead.
Can I respond to those captions? I'm really pleased that someone attended to the sky. That was a very conscious compositional choice, because I was really thinking about openness versus closed. Something that looks open is actually very closed. Sorry, was there another comment just posted?
Yeah, someone just wrote, I sense or feel the emptiness.
Yes, it's empty, and it's not a friendly, welcoming empty. It's aggressive. You are not to tread here. That's really what that's saying. And of course, you would not know this if you weren't living through this particular moment.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is sort of related, but yeah, why don't you talk us through this one? And again, we invite everybody to offer their captions or their thoughts on this image.
Again, thinking through ideas of the image as something that is permeated with layers. I often think about Benjamin's work, and people think, what is the truth of the image? And for Benjamin, a truth is something palimpsestic. What that means is that it's like someone's written on a page, erased it, written over it again, erased it, and it's layers and layers and layers of semi-transparent. Somewhere in those layers is some kind of truth to the image. And that always seems to be a dialogical process. So if we go to process theory like Bakhtin, and also the work of Whitehead in The Function of Reason, we see that there is a big push against formalistic analysis in a process mind, right? So I look at this image. This is Charles de Gaulle Airport, Paris, one of the busiest airports in the entire world. And again, this is the end of March 2020. France is in the middle of the harsh lockdown enforced by police on the streets who ask you for documentation for why you are outside. So that's the context. And this is Charles de Gaulle, and a woman is looking at the time for the flights leaving. again, something you never see ever is this emptiness. And it's an emptiness that signals, amongst other things, airlines crashing, right? Flights canceled. What looks peaceful is, again, full of anxiety. So many people panicking to leave that country at that time because borders were closing.
Yeah, and some of our contributions here, some said it looks like a binding grid, a human sandwich between the gray voids, managing the experiences of the times, an empty airport, partiality, waiting, lines, an Asian-looking woman who would be shunned during the pandemic.
Yes, the very few groups of people who were traveling to very distant locales, and their airlines were still repatriating or were in a process of repatriating. So there were groups from India and China in the airport at that time. I purposely included the lines of the ceiling and the lines that guide people standing in line. Usually you have a mass of people like jammed trying to get on a flight. There's no one in line. There is no one in those lines. And it's all about the lines that go nowhere. So, you know, it's like, where are we going? We don't know.
Yeah.
So you see, I love the idea of like your images and Jerry's images addressing some of the current times and crisis. And for me, it's like, in some ways, it's a different because you in both of your images, CC, it's this emptiness that speaks to the crisis and the fact that like what's normal or what grounds us or what makes us social isn't there or is limited or a part of the crisis. And then at the same time, Jerry, your images are at the same point in time in history to some degree in general, but it's like people forcing themselves to be in these spaces, to protest, to socialize, even in the midst of, like, Cece, you mentioned that you didn't see any police officers, knowing, you know, that they're there, that there's still this, for lack of a better word, angst about being social right now, but people are still doing it for various reasons.
Yeah, I see. I think even though they seem to be different, there's that commonality about filling in the space. Even though my spaces seem to be filled with a lot of people, but the others not, they still were filled. In other words, they were filled by the viewer. I was struck by Carolina's photographs because they reminded me so much of your photo of the field. You know, where you provided the richness of it, where I ordinarily would look at that field and say, gee, you know, it's an agricultural place. It may have at one time have been a rice field or something. But that was my limited knowledge of what that place was. And yet you filled it, you know, you filled it beautifully with your understanding and your knowledge. By the way, understanding, knowledge being two different things, right? So there's that kind of blank history that any one of us could read, but you know, your experience of that history would not be the same as my own. And the same thing true with Carolina looking at the border. And I can go back to some other kinds of things too, because what we tend to do is we should, as human beings, we tend to anticipate also, you know, go beyond what's there to make up stories about what it is that we see, which also come from our imagination, right? And we have those different stories. It'd be interesting is if this was a class, if it was a class, you know, for a literary class. You know, now David teaches visual literacy, you know, and so we could see how the visual literacy would translate into writing. You know, write about this shoe. that you see here. Write about the chain link fence. I think of chain link fences as being essentially to keep things out. You know, and somebody who's been in prison would say, well, there's something to keep things in. You know, I see that scene there. I'm thinking of some vicious dog that's behind it, protecting the territory. And I've been in Charles de Gaulle many times, and you know, when it's crowded, and looking at those lines above, that's a great shot. That you show. For me, that's a photographer's picture. You know, which is beyond, aesthetically beyond the accidentally beautiful photographs I occasionally take.
Thanks, Jerry.
Mm.
I wonder what it would be like to ask someone to perform. Oh, I'm sorry, Denise.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, I wonder what it would be like, Jerry, just going off of your connection to visual literacy and writing, what it would be like to ask someone to perform any one of these images. And I don't mean mimic, but however you would language what you understand of the image. What would you move your body? Would you draw? Would you correlate it with some piece of music or sound, you know?
Yeah. I could see, you know, when somebody mentioned the detective mystery, that was, again, and my friend Gabri, who I see on the chat, who's a criminologist, you know, using visual stuff, you know, said, you know, look like a crime scene, you know, but look like a crime scene, both in terms of a real crime scene, but even more so, the kind of crime scene you would see in a detective movie or series, you know. And then behind that, of course, there would be dum dum dum, you know, some kind of, you know, mysterious music that would be there. And again, what's so wonderful, I think, about this collection of people that we have here is that it's drawing out not only from us, but from the people who are watching and listening to us, you know, so many other connections and things, you know, which fill, you know, a void. In essence, that's what we have here. We think we have something that's just full of stuff. It becomes more and more like a void as we realize how much could be added to it from the people who are watching and listening.
Yeah, and I'm also struck that, like, it seems we're saying something visual sociology can do is teach a bit of that visual literacy, David, that you were talking about, but also inspire a lot of conversation and interaction to kind of critically think through the things that we think we see. So I appreciated how you sort of made a call to our audience who are joining us today to offer up some captions. But I'm wondering if you all could speak a little bit more of that relationship between, like, teaching of visual literacy, but also kind of doing a form of social justice or activism. If you see that there's a relationship between the two, or if that's very important to you, especially as teachers or those who engage with others with the visual.
Yeah, I can speak a little to that. I mean, this picture that we're seeing right now is part of this visual literacy curriculum or program is situated exactly to help young folks use photography to mill around the outside of the school building in a community that they call their own, to just document, to just take pictures. And see what comes out of it. And, you know, in terms of visual sociology, one of the things that particularly came out of this body of work was there were tons of images, probably like at least 100 images of just things, not necessarily people taking pictures of classmates or friends. And and so it became data in terms of thinking about how the students, like what community is there for them, and what things that they have to interact with every day, and how that might impress themselves on how somebody feels, believes, whatever the case might be. So, you know, and it's a lot about like ontology. So it's a lot about like living with things, not just humans again, but just things. And when you live in for me, it was telling, because the students, when we collected these images, got a chance to talk about the beautiful flowers and on somebody's fence or on somebody's porch, but they also were able to talk about, like in this same photographer, Alex, there was like a dead carcass. I don't know if it was a dog or whatever, but this guy like got right to it and took pictures of it, where any of the other kids were like, they're not going next to it, but he wanted to witness that. And when you look at the body of work, you get to see the things that these students in this community, broken glass, like I said, the flowers, or a beautiful house, or maybe somebody's sitting on their porch. But I just think in terms of your question, Denise, when we think about imaging, and social civic aspects of visual sociology, it's very prevalent in like this image and the work that's around this image.
Yeah, thank you.
Well,
We do, oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I'm thinking I've spoken much too much already, and so let Carolina talk some more, I think.
Oh, well, that's okay. Jerry, if you had a comment?
Well, not so much a comment, but to talk about the things, you know, again, the things that I do in terms of filling in. And I just very briefly explain, I took a walk in Germany in a little town because of an old friend of mine was a soldier who in World War II, who had discovered a work camp, what people call concentration camp, in the Harz Mountains in Germany. And he spoke about his experience there and the shame he felt because he was German when he saw this. And what he wrote about was that people said they didn't see what was going on, right? And this is what I'm talking about, the power, I think, of the visual. Wish I was a better photographer. So I went to the place and I walked the route of this, what they called a soul march. In other words, 3 times a day, the concentration camp workers were walked from where they were staying to the caves in the mountains where they were worked at. And I said to myself, they walked through the town. You know, so I photographed as I went along the way in order to show that there was no way in hell that people in that town could not have seen these hundreds of people marching 3 times a day to this particular place. You know, now even though it was so many years later, it was the same route. And what and the meaning for me and for my students and for the people that I talk to about this phenomenon is this ability that human beings have not to see what's right in front of their face, to turn away, right? In this certain times during the day, what they did is they put their shades down. If you're familiar with Western European towns and stuff like that, they're very unusual that you put the shades down in the middle of the day because it shows that you're too lazy, you're sleeping in, right? But they would do that, right? And so again, there's this kind of filling in of meaning because of what we can see and what we can show, and I think it's confrontational. It's confrontational. You know, just like David's images and Carolina's images, they are confronting. you know, they're asking a question. What do you see here? You know, and information will be supplied. I want to say also in this particular place, I took photographs of what was left of where the bodies were burned. So it not only did they not see things, they said they couldn't smell, right? And there was no way that they couldn't smell the burning bodies of you know, the flesh, you know. You know, sensory, maybe that's the sensory sociology that I think we're all doing. Yeah.
We actually have a question from the audience from Samuel. Samuel asks, how can one deploy visual sociology in telling or creating compelling visual stories? Do you have any tips?
Well, I think that it's about attending to complexity. Now, people do this in photo elicitation work, all kinds of empirical work. They do this when they create digital stories and oral histories, because there are combinations of audio-visual influences that participants are powerfully lending their voices to and their vision to. It's connected to your prior question of this role of social justice and visual literacies, and I'll keep that in the plural because as we all know from Chalfin and others' work in Through Navajo Eyes, early visual anthropology, that when they gave the Navajo cameras, they were utterly shocked by what they filmed because they did not ascribe to the same visual languages. So visual literacies depends on who and where you are. Now, photography has a set of visual languages that are standardized worldwide through iconographic conventions. But I think we are careful in visual sociology to think about, and this is where the social justice piece works, and this is where the compelling piece works, is to say, hold on, what and whose iconographic conventions are being deployed, if I'm going to use that term as well, or used here, and whose agenda does that serve? If we look at, I'm doing a study on selfies. Everyone's taking selfies, but people look at their selfies from high school or even from a few days ago, and they say, oh, that's the old me. That's not me. That does not look good. At that time, that was a fabulous selfie. That's why it was shared on Instagram. But time has passed. You have changed. Your understanding of the form has changed. And more articles on how to take the perfect selfie from that sort of above angle and so on and so forth. The discussions of lighting and angle, drawing on photographic traditions are also impacting how you see that image and what you think your visual literacies are. But as we look at how different people see in different places, and Jerry's example of Eastern European blinds up or down, that is a form of visual literacy as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I know we only have about a couple minutes left already, but I wanted to get to one more question from the audience. Gabri says, we're working on a book about visual literacy for lawyers. There's a lot of visuals, for example, footage from body cams, smartphones, CCTV, showing police conduct. What are the most important questions to ask to critically evaluate these visuals? Dutch police have said they are edited, manipulated, framed, and so on.
Of course, I would totally agree with that. If you look at the history of forensic photography and the police, photography and the way metrical photography was used was not just to document a crime scene, it was used to create a compelling story and to invoke viewers into attributing guilt to someone. So I think that the history of forensic photography and photography in criminology is that photography has often been used as accusation, and meanings have been attributed that may not be inherent in the image, but people weave a story around it. So the angle from above in a room of a body, or of remnants, or tire tracks, whatever it may be, it depends on how you present the rest of the circumstantial evidence around that. So I think Sherwin wrote a great book on visuality and law. And I think that contextual information, but I think what's important is to look at what are the iconic conventions around criminological photography, and how did it come to be that way?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would suggest that I wrote it down for Cambre also, that, you know, to look at crime photographers also, such as, you know, Ouija and other had recently had an exhibition, to see the similarities and differences between the official crime photographers for the police department, the forensic people, the district attorney's office, etc. See how they're different or they're similar. And we certainly remember the Central Park Five in terms of the photography that we had here. Not necessarily, they had of the scene, but then they started showing pictures, you know, like allegedly of the perpetrators, you know, and you know, it's very important for us to kind of get across the power of the image in all kinds of social interactions, especially in a courthouse. It's why we don't see things as well. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, there was a clarification to the question. So she said, I meant footage of police violence. I don't know if that helps with your guys' response.
Yes, absolutely. I think what's happening with footage of police violence is that protesters and ordinary people on the street are using their phones as to document. Footage of police violence is often contested terrain, just like any other criminological imagery. So what's important in those cases for people who are interested in that is to collect many recordings of something that happened from a range of different angles.
I would say too that from a historical perspective, at least in the US, to look at images of slavery and the images that came after slavery, what we could call as propaganda, or you know, however you want to label it, but criminalizing particular people and situating them against whatever the good of the society could help, like could be useful in terms of, at least in the United States, situating the relationships, historical relationships between particular bodies, period, right?
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, y'all, I know the time really flew. It's already a little past 1:30. But I wanted to invite the panelists if you have any sort of last remarks you want to share with our audience before they leave.
Well, a very short comment. It might be, somebody asked about examples, and I know all of us have examples, articles, and things like that. You know, that we would be, I think most of us would be happy to share them with you, so that people could go through the PPAC website to pick them up, so that people can see actually what it is and how we use images, which might be helpful. The other thing I want to say in reference to David's comment about seeing slavery, right? There are plenty of images and stuff like that, but they weren't shown, you know, and the kinds of things I think most people today in the United States are much more likely to have been exposed to Showboat or Gone with the Wind or Song of the South, you know, as visions of what slavery was like in the United States. They're much more likely to get the propaganda about, you know, the happy slavery that existed rather than the reality of it. And I think it's up to us, you know, in terms of, if we're talking about visual literacy, I mean, to get the visuals into the eyes of the people who need to see it. You know, with by the way, with the attendant commentary, because otherwise, you remember also that people went to lynchings. They were big events, and there are lots of photographs, and they made postcards out of those things. You know, they were celebrated. Yeah, I hate to end on that horrible note, but I'll just keep quiet. Right.
David or Cece, did you want to?
Yeah. Sure. I first of all, I'm very grateful for the comments and the sharing and sort of the thoughtful presence of everyone who's been here. And we've touched on some ideas and some themes that do merit much more in-depth treatment. And I hope that people will leave here with a sense of curiosity and desire to further that. And I would say that when you're photographing, when you're pulling out your phone, or if you're carrying around a camera, to also think about why am I taking this picture? What is compelling to me as a human being here in this moment? And what do I think I'm showing or telling? That sort of embodied sort of sense of why am I here? Why am I taking this photo? I think will help us work through what I think is the problem of our time right now. It's not the problem of the image, as W.J.T. Mitchell famously said. I mean, the image has always been an issue, as we know from wars of iconophobia, right? But we've had wars over images. I think the problem is the digital mediation. How do we trust? What do we consider evidence? What do we feel is true? And how do we work to mark that and understand that? I think the question of the trust of the digital mediated image is really something that we should all be thinking about as we work through our images.
Thank you, Cece. And David?
Yeah, well, again, thanks to PPAC and Denise. This has been a pleasure. To Jerry and Cece, I appreciate everything. I guess the last word I would leave with is the sociological problem is unity. So when you look at an image, when you take an image, just be mindful of, and this has been talked about, but be mindful of what is there to normalize your looking, and really attend to the bits and the pieces, those minor gestures, as Aaron Manning says, that actually make up these bigger, well-known aspects of our looking and knowing. So just be attentive. And you're looking and then you're taking. You take photographs. I would say an exercise is to just walk somewhere and just literally just take images. Don't even really look at the camera. Just take images and then go back and print those out or look at them on the screen and really pay attention to what you just passed through.
Thank you so much, David. That's the perfect closing words, that we just want to leave you all hopefully feeling more curious, kind of inspired to be really critical, hopefully to take images and think about your positionality, the history of what you're looking at, and what you think it can do, especially in relationship to issues around social justice. I know we went over time. Thank you all to the audience members who stuck with us to the end. We wish you all well. We hope that you stay safe and healthy. Thank you, thank you.